hear from Grand Chief Edward Jones, one of the leading voices in the indigenous peoples movement across the world. Grand Chief Jones came here in Dharamsala to celebrate His Holiness 80th birthday, and we are delighted to hear from him on his insights on the evolving state of human rights for the indigenous peoples and the prospects it presents to resolving the Sino-Tibetan conflict. Before we start the talk, please allow me to give a very brief introduction to the speaker. Grand Chief Edward Jones is a hereditary chief of the Tladzen Nation in northern British Columbia. He is an indigenous leader who has dedicated his life to the pursuit of social and economic justice for Canada's indigenous people, having both in indigenous politics, business, and community development. Chief Jones has been a lawyer for 30 years. He holds a BA from the University of Victoria, a law degree from the University of British Columbia, and honorary Doctor of Law degree from the University of Northern British Columbia and the University of Victoria. Chief Jones has served in many leadership roles at the local, provincial, national, and international levels. He is currently serving his 9th consecutive term on the First Nations Summit Task Group. He is a former cabinet minister with the government of British Columbia. He is a former co-chair of the North American Indigenous Peoples Caucus and participated in the development of the Declaration on the Rights of the Indigenous Peoples, which was adopted by the United Nations General Assembly in September 2007. In 2009, he co-chaired the 3rd Indigenous Leaders Summit of the Americas in Panama City and represented the Indigenous Leaders of the Americas at the 5th Summit of the Americas in Trinidad and Tobago. Grand Chief Jones was reappointed for a second 3-year term as the North American representative to the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. He served a 1-year term as chair of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues in 2012. So this is a very, very brief introduction to Grand Chief Edward Jones. And for the session today, may I request Sitong Novelova Sangila to moderate the session. And Grand Chief Edward Jones, the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you. Idechus kana masi chono tasne. This teo te jano keo na sha no keo hun ayune bayan no keo hun le tun sin di su cho ne no gahin le wasnas ba hun to na san. I wanted to share a few words with you in my own indigenous language. It's a language that's spoken by the Dene speaking people in northern Canada, as well as in southwestern United States with the Navajo and the Apache. It is my wife, Wendy, and my first time here to India. And we came at the invitation of our friend Tenzin. And I understand there's hundreds of Tenzins, so.
Most of them.
More.
From the 3rd row.
So I wanted to say those few words in my own language just to acknowledge, but forgive me for not acknowledging our Prime Minister here and for being the gracious host you are this week. I know that Tenzin is a good friend of yours and many others here. His father is a very good friend of the Dalai Lama, as he visited our house and we had dinner and a barbecue. So we got to know a bit of the people from Tenzin's family, but also some of the Mongolian and also Tibetan basketball players playing a basketball tournament in our gym in our village. So it was a very nice gathering of Tibetan people who live in Vancouver to come and to visit our community and to feel welcome in the way of our people. And each one of them, we stood them up one by one, all of them, about 20 players, and we acknowledge and thank every one of them to come into our village in Vancouver and to say thank you for coming and to feel welcomed by the Indigenous peoples. And so that's the heart that we come with. We come with very good intentions. We were invited to celebrate with the people in Tibet and people all over the world His Holiness's 80th birthday. And it was such an honor to be here on June 21st and June 22nd when the people came together at the residence to celebrate and to acknowledge the human dignity that he showed to all of us, and he shows to each and every one of us every day. That he's an important man to all of us, and we deeply appreciate his wisdom and his teachings, and he does it with such great compassion that people all over the world feel it. And I want to talk about that from an Indigenous perspective. I was absolutely surprised yesterday. I was in the back of the hall over by the entrance to his residence at the gate. Somebody came up and said, "We want you to come up." And I thought I'd be sitting on the chair over in the side somewhere. And then the president said, "No, up to His Holiness wants you to sit up near him." And it was absolutely an honor for me to be able to have a discussion with him. The humanity that he shows to each and every one of us is certainly a lesson that we all need, peoples all over the world. From an Indigenous perspective, maybe I'll start, as I said yesterday. I saw the many pictures of the Dalai Lama in Australia. And he talked about it yesterday, and it very, very deeply touched me what he said in the back, but also what he said publicly about his special trip to meet with the Indigenous peoples at Uluru. The Australian Indigenous peoples are part of the Pacific region. As our moderator explained, I am a member of the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. I'm one of the 8 Indigenous nominated from around the world. And there are 8 state elected representatives, so there are 16 altogether, except Asia this time has not elected 1 state representative, so there are 15. The purpose of the United Nations Permanent Forum is the main advisory body on Indigenous issues to the United Nations. Each and every one of the 16 members are appointed as independent experts in our personal capacity. So our responsibility is every 2 weeks we meet at the United Nations in New York and thousands of people, Indigenous people from around the world, gather from South and the other regions, being Asia, the Russian Federation, the African continent, Latin America, the Arctic is a separate region, North America, the Pacific, the regions that we are divided into. And as I mentioned, there are 370 million Indigenous peoples globally. And as His Holiness explained yesterday, what he saw in Australia and the way he talked about it is sadly only too true in all countries, developing and developed countries, the situation of Indigenous peoples. So it was absolutely important for me to hear what he had to say on this stage up here about the situation of Indigenous peoples. Because as many of you may know, that in many cases, no one's able to speak for them, powerless in their own countries. And I know you understand what it is like to be and to feel that loss of power in your own homeland. In the homeland where I come from, Canada, is part of North America and is part of the Americas. And in 1492, there was an Italian sailor sailing on behalf of the Queen of Spain, traveling to India. He didn't make it all the way to India. He landed on the shores of the Americas, and he thought he was in India. So he gave us the name Indians, Los Indians. But it wasn't truly who we were. He was mistaken, and he was in the wrong place. So we ended up being called the North American Indians and the South American Indians. And we've used that name only to find out later on that other people over here have that name, and that somebody gave us somebody else's name. So in the Americas, there are 34 states, and the first slaves in the Americas were indigenous. The colonizing powers in Europe of the day, in the late 1400s, their job was two things. They thought we were heathens because we didn't practice a Christian religion, and they thought we were not civilized because we did not practice their ways of civilization. But they didn't understand the astronomy of the Mayan people. For example, in 2012, on December 21st, I went to a Mayan temple in Guatemala with the Mayan spiritual leaders. And all through the evening, they said farewell to grandfather's son. And at sunrise, they said, welcome to the child son. And it was the end of the 13th Baktun, the long count calendar that runs over 5,000 years. And I was on top of the temple, looking to the east, and it was cloudy, so we didn't see the sun coming up. But my friend, who was ambassador from Mexico, he had an iPhone, and he said, Chief, come here. And he had this application on his iPhone called Skyview. And he showed me, and the sun and all of the planets were lined up like that. Pluto was behind us. And it was the Mayan people's astronomy was absolutely right on, confirmed by science. And these were the people who were deemed to be uncivilized. So there's a long history in Canada and the United States, in the region where I come from, and the relationship between the colonizers, French and the English colonizers of the day in the northern part, and the southern part were the Portuguese and the English as well as the Spaniards. And there was brutality. Indigenous peoples were enslaved. The very first slaves in America were indigenous peoples. And they were massacred by the thousands. Disease that our people had no resistance to decimated our population. So over a period in North America, there was this notion of the vanishing Indian, the noble savage, will be gone soon. And that was a philosophy and a policy of the government in Canada, which was formed only in 1867. It's a very new government. And they established a policy that was practiced until the late 1950s to assimilate Indian people. Our children, me included, were taken from our communities and put away in these institutions called Indian residential schools. And we were, through us as children, we were to lose our language and our culture. So it was very heartwarming to hear His Holiness talk about language and culture and the necessity and the need to continue that. And I am absolutely impressed here how this is carried on by the people who live in exile, by a government that's in exile from its own lands. In a way, as Indigenous peoples in Canada, we were exiled in our own homelands. We were put into small Indian reservations that were economically not productive, marginalized. Our spiritual practices were criminalized. Our cultural practices were criminalized. Our people ended up in jail over that. Similar to many of the stories I've heard, the brutality of what has happened and still happening to the people from Tibet. And it's a long history. In our country, in Canada, we just completed 7 years, 3 individuals who were appointed to a commission, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission on Indian Residential Schools. And they, during the course of our history, in a neighborhood of 150,000 of our kids were taken from our communities and put into these institutions. And the Truth and Reconciliation Commission came to the conclusion that there was cultural genocide on the part of Canada towards Indigenous peoples. In a Royal Commission report, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Canada, a week before the Commission came out with its report, I'm talking within the last month now, came to the conclusion that Indian residential schools was an act of cultural genocide. It was to assimilate our people, to wipe out our civilization, to Christianize us, and to civilize us. That was the policy. And so, notwithstanding all of that, our people survived and continue to survive. And what we have been doing, the laws that made it a criminal offense to practice our ways, the laws only changed in the middle 1950s, not 60 years ago or so. And following that, we are not allowed to hire lawyers or to gather like this to talk about our land. And we had to have permission from these reservations they had. If we had to go away from the reservation, we had to get permission from the government agent to go somewhere else. This is a part of the history that many people do not understand. Canada is a very wealthy country. Canada is a well-developed country. And we are proud of that country for sure. But we're also mindful of where we have been. Because of the strong assimilation policy, many of our languages are endangered. So when the Prime Minister apologized, Prime Minister of Canada apologized to the survivor of Indian residential schools, there was no support behind the apology to help revive and re-strengthen and reinvigorate our languages. And so, I come here and my eyes completely wide open, my heart's open to listen to all of the messages, because it is a new land to me, to my wife, different cultures, different peoples. But what I found here, despite all of the differences in the humanity of who we are as peoples, we're all the same. And that's the realization of the message from His Holiness that I heard and saw yesterday. I was absolutely honored to be able to have lunch with His Holiness, to have lunch with all of the people who were gathered, the High Lamas who were there, the politicians, the political leaders, the nuns, the people who came off the street to see and to witness what's going on, and to see that, His Holiness is eating with the people, the very same meal that everybody's having, he's having. And I thought, this is really, he's one of us, he's one of the people, common people like us. And that really impressed me. With that really strong foundation of a people's, the heart of a people shows very strongly. It showed very strongly. It is with that heart, it's very, I think it sounds to me that it's less of a problem for the people from Tibet who live in exile, whether they're here, or have a government in exile, or they're living in other parts of Canada with the teachings that are there, to have a degree of cohesion that's so important to the survival and the dignity of your peoples in Tibet and here who are in exile. And there are many examples of how we have made progress in our own respective North America region. In the United States, in the early part, in the mid-1770s, 3 very important cases went to the Supreme Court of the United States. And what the Supreme Court Chief Justice Marshall said that even though these people have lost a degree of sovereignty, they still retain the notion or the nation of domestic dependent nation, a nation within a nation. And so Indian tribes in the United States have a degree of authority, a degree of self-determination. They have their own parliaments, their own governments. They have an executive branch. They have a judiciary. They have their own law enforcement within the territory of their tribes, what are called reservations. We see that in other parts in Canada as well, in Nunavut, in the north. It's a public government in the northeastern part of Canada. The main population are the Inuit people. And there's a form of public government that's open to everybody, not just the Inuit people. And they have the authority to make laws and to practice their governing authority within that territory. And they do. There's a relationship, of course, with central government in Ottawa. Issues relating to resource development. The basis of the economy the basis of wealth comes from the land, whether it's minerals or hydroelectric power or forestry. In the north, of course, they don't have much of a forest. But they have been able to form a government of a concept of a nation with a nation. The notion of self-determination has been explained many different ways. In the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, this little booklet here, Article 3 talks about the right to self-determination. Maybe I'll just read the paragraph straight from, it's one paragraph. Indigenous peoples have the right to self-determination. By virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. I heard that on day one when the political leaders were speaking on June 21st, the notion of self-determination. Article 4 talks about Indigenous peoples in exercising their right to self-determination have the right to autonomy or self-government in matters relating to their internal and local affairs, as well as ways and means for financing their autonomous functions. The notion of authority, the notion of administration within the territory. But you see, this had to be approved by the member states, the 192 member states of the United Nations. And they were concerned that maybe they're opening a door that they would be very difficult for them to deal with. So there inserted another Article 46, the very last article of the Declaration. Nothing in this declaration may be interpreted as implying for any state, people, group, or person any right to engage in any activity or to perform any act contrary to the Charter of the United Nations or construed as authorizing or encouraging any action which would dismember, impair, totally or in part, the territorial integrity or political unity of sovereign and independent states. And it goes on, in the exercise of the rights enunciated in the present declaration, human rights and fundamental freedoms of all shall be respected. The exercise of the rights set forth in this declaration shall be subject only to such limitations as are determined by law in accordance with international human rights obligations. Any such limitation shall be non-discriminatory and strictly necessary solely for the purpose of securing due recognition and respect for the rights and freedoms of others and for meeting the just and most compelling requirements of a democratic society. And lastly, Article 46.3, the provisions set forth in this declaration shall be interpreted in accordance with the principles of justice, democracy, respect for human rights, equality, non-discrimination, good governance, and good faith. This declaration was endorsed. Only four countries voted against the declaration. I was in attendance when the UN General Assembly came to a vote. 4 countries voted against, 4 countries said no. Canada, the United States, New Zealand, and Australia. 4 countries said no in not supporting the declaration. They have since changed their views, and now it has become a unanimously supported declaration at the United Nations. Following this, last September at the United Nations General Assembly, there was a World Conference on Indigenous Peoples, and this declaration became the central focal point. United Nations agencies are to develop a system-wide action plan on how they will implement the principles and the norms that are established in this declaration. Each state is required to establish a national action plan on how to implement the declaration standards and norms. Why am I saying this here? It does apply to Indigenous peoples who are affected most deeply by colonization in history, even colonization now. And notwithstanding that, Indigenous peoples since the 1920s, the 1920s, 2 of our leaders, a Maori leader and an Indian leader from Canada and United States, went to the League of Nations, the pre-runner of the United Nations, and they were turned away. They were turned away at the door. They were not allowed. So over a long period of time, there was continually a strong sense of advocacy on behalf of Indigenous peoples. It was following the Second World War when we saw what happened in Germany to the Jewish people with the genocide that was practiced on those peoples who we call the Jewish people. And the United Nations was formed shortly thereafter. A United Nations Charter was established. Conventions on civil and political rights were established. There was a focus now on human rights globally. And that focus became very important for all peoples. And we were a part of that. In the 21st century, in the first 15 years of the 21st century, of course, we still see many different acts that need to be challenged. Many different acts against peoples and their cultures and their languages are still happening now. And as I've heard over the last 2 days, very distinctly, this includes the people from Tibet, in Tibet as well as outside of Tibet. In the face of all of this, the heart of the Tibetan people has remained strong, and I witnessed that. It was my absolute honor to be here and to listen. The country, China, was a country that supported this declaration. If they're able to support this declaration in relation to indigenous peoples, and the principles are largely the same in many respects, whether it's a particular declaration, this is the only declaration of its kind that I'm aware of as it relates to peoples. There are many other human rights bodies. There are many other international instruments at the UN level that have been approved. The question, of course, is between the commitments that the states make, the 192 member states of the UN, the commitments that are made, and the actions that are taken to apply those commitments. Always a tremendously large gap. And that continues to be a challenge for many peoples. And so I come here thinking to myself, what story can I say that is different than what His Holiness has to say? I think his story and his teachings have been compelling, and that the direction that the political leadership is taking, the direction that the people want to move in, and the direction that His Holiness has made very public over many years are very much consistent with what are in the declaration here. It's always an incredible challenge to find that place of resolution, that place of reconciliation. This morning I listened to one of the men who lived in Tibet, who became a monk, didn't understand that he was Tibetan, didn't have his language or culture, but began learning and eventually entered into a monastery. And he told us his story about his actions in his own homeland, about being a Tibetan, and for which he was imprisoned and tortured. That story broke my heart. And so I saw the heart of that man and how he was able to survive. And through him I saw the heart of all Tibetan peoples, whether in Tibet or exiled or living in other countries. And that I saw a very strong heart and a very determined peoples willing to continue to be who you are as Tibetan people, to remain strong to your roots and to your culture and to the teachings of your peoples. Because in the diversity of humanity, in the diversity of civilizations, it is important that we remember our ancestors, that we remember where we come from. In North America and in Canada, we practice our ways. We are proud to be who we are. Under the yoke of colonialism, we remain defiant and steadfast. In a way similar to yours, but in a way very different to what you have experienced as peoples. And so we share that common background. I came here to, in a way, on a fact-finding tour, in a way to learn, but most importantly to celebrate His Holiness's 80th birthday. I was kind of shocked yesterday when he invited me to sit next to him. But I was telling my friend Tenzin that yesterday morning I felt very good. I had a very good dream, and I was very comfortable. And I was coming to meet the Prime Minister. I didn't even meet him yesterday. I met His Holiness instead. I can't say whether today or yesterday was better.
Yesterday was fast.
No, I'm only teasing His Excellency the Prime Minister here, and I just wanted to share those few words with you. And it's absolutely an honor for myself and for my wife to come here and to witness and to hear from the people share how determined peoples are, that the survival and the dignity and the well-being of the people of Tibet are in very good hands. And those hands are yours, you who make this your life work, the work that you do in support of your people in this exiled communities or around the world, or in support of those who continue to live in your homeland. So, Mr. Prime Minister, I really appreciate the opportunity to share these few words with you. I was asked this morning, late this morning, if I would meet with you, and I didn't know what I was going to talk about, to be honest with you, but I thought about it all day, and my wife and I, we talked briefly about the messages, as well as our friend Tenzin. Without him, we wouldn't have been here. He's the one that made this possible. I saw how the Holiness loves this man here. As I understand that his father and His Holiness are very good friends. And he said some words in Tibetan and hit him on the head as if he was a 10-year-old boy.
That's for different reasons.
So thank you, Prime Minister. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Grand Chief. It was sheer karmic coincidence what happened yesterday. The morning I left, I told my wife, today I really don't have anything much to do. I don't have to give a talk, so I'll have a relaxed time and enjoy the event. After reaching there, we all learned, at least I learned, that now I have to sit in folded legs, in a lotus position, for 4.5 hours. The maximum I could do since 2011, when I took over, half an hour, 1 hour and a half was maximum. 2 hours was, that's it. So yesterday when it was 4.5 hours, I was finding excuses when to get up, as I have something to do. So when my security came and said, Grand Chief and Tenzin are waiting to see me, I was like, I have to sit through the program. So what am I supposed to do? And I said, okay, why don't you call them so that I get to stand up and walk, take a break. So then I went to His Holiness and said, Grand Chief is here from the First Nation, Your Holiness. And you would never know what His Holiness would do. You know, again, this karmic thing. He said, okay, you make them sit here. I made you sit next to, and he said, now where do they sit? I said, there are some chairs here, and why not we sit there? Okay. And I was hoping that I could also stand there for a few more minutes. But then the Rinpoche was speaking, as for protocol, I have to go back and sit. So I got my break, and then I went back to sit. Then His Holiness just went with it, and sat with you, and then chatted with you, and got along. Then later I got a message, the His Holiness told you to speak to the audience. And then it's a sheer karmic coincidence that you brought a shawl and shoes made by 94-year-old grandmother. Mm-hmm. So, you know, and then yesterday, as we all were Devi Falls, we all were praying for His Holiness to live long, mm-hmm. so that he live for 100 years. So 94 years old grandma sending a pair of shoes to keep him warm in winter and cool in summer, I thought that was also an auspicious sign. So it all worked out. Then when Solomon started his speech, he went on with indigenous people from Maori to, the Aborigines in Australia to Canada and everywhere. So you saw his vast knowledge. And certainly we are always surprised. His Solomon is not just knowledge, but throughout his life, he has reached out to these people with a purpose, with a vision. The fact that he had reached out to so many indigenous people, indigenous leaders, he had this vision in mind. Their situation is very much similar to ours. They're facing challenges very much similar to us. Hence, he should show solidarity with them, and not just show solidarity in words, but in deeds. He did go to the people of Aborigines in Australia, the holy place, and all the places he visited. So, whenever he goes to New Zealand, when he meets Maori people, he greets them, like they do, with a shaking of his nose or whatever, the bang of the nose that they do. So it was sheer comic coincidence. I think you came not to see me, actually, I was the channel for you to introduce to His Holiness. So, we welcome you here, really.
Thank you.
And after His Holiness addressed the indigenous people's issue, we also felt that our staff should have the honor and privilege to listen to you, your situation, your challenges, and you being in the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous People. So we also have several questions in mind, one being whether Tibetans can be categorized as indigenous people or not. One definition assumes that they are the original people of the land. Now Tibetans, we say we are separate from Chinese, so if we call us indigenous people, then could we be defined as the original people of China? So then in that definition, we don't want to fit in that bracket. Having said that, the challenges what we are facing in Tibet is very similar to indigenous people. And also what really surprised me in some ways with pain was when you said that Ban Ki-moon, the Secretary General of the United Nations, said there are 370 million indigenous people around the world, but every week one language of indigenous people dies. Every week is dying. So every month 4 languages. Every year 48 languages. That's a major challenge. On the other hand, when we look at ourselves, we don't have a country of our own. And we face these challenges of culture assimilation, losing our language, all that. But then indigenous people have their own land, so to speak. At least they are suffering different kinds of discrimination, yet they have their own land. Even the fact that they have their own land, the people are in their own land are losing one language every week. So this is altogether a different challenges of globalization, modernization, assimilation of the democratic richest nation. So in that sense, Tibetans are facing dual challenges, one of colonization, one of assimilation, forceful assimilation inside, and voluntary assimilation or melting pot process. So hence we are faced these dual challenges and how to deal with it. So one question is, does Tibetan people fit in the definition of indigenous people? And if so, can we assert self-determination even though there is Article 46 and others as qualifier? Number 2 is, how does the UN Permanent Forum of Indigenous People work? How does it work? You said many people come and make appeals and petition. Is it just an advisory body? What it can do, publish reports and send a recommendation to the General Assembly or the Security Council? Or is there authority and the budget to do something about the indigenous people rights? So if you could address 2 of those things.
That's why he went to Harvard, so he could ask tough questions. Absolutely essential what this idea of education, to bring all of our peoples a degree of education wherever and however, so that we have people like yourself with very good education who come back to the communities and to use those knowledge and skills to help better the dignity and the survival and the well-being of peoples. The question of indigenous, there is no definition as such of who indigenous peoples are. And partly the reason for that is it's very, very difficult to categorize. For example, on the African continent, we have 54 states on that continent. And many of the states do not recognize indigenous peoples, but they say we are all indigenous in Africa. And then the Maasai said in Kenya, no, we are indigenous as Maasai. And the Pygmies in Congo Brazzaville say we are indigenous. The San people say we are indigenous. So the concept is that we have been on this land, on this part of the land, on this continent for thousands of years. We have our languages, we have our customs, we have our ways, and we have our territory where we call home. And that for those reasons we determine that we are indigenous peoples. And so are Tibetans indigenous? Do they fit the definition of indigenous? That's up to the people in Tibet to determine that. And then I think, all of the standards that I've mentioned are the standards that are at the UN. Africa, the entire continent of Africa was colonized by many of the countries who, to the north of them, European countries, colonizing pretty much all of Africa, a long period of decolonization that's been taking place since at least the 1950s, process of decolonization. Indigenous peoples in some part of the world, the Hawaiians, the native Hawaiians, their lands were taken by the British as a colony, and then subsequently by the United States, became a part of that republic. Native Hawaiians continue to assert that they are independent. Other Pacific Island, indigenous people, Pacific Island states, there are same stories. But in many cases, as indigenous peoples in Canada and the United States, there are treaties of sovereignty between indigenous peoples and the state government, whether it's Canada or the United States. The Supreme Court of Canada in the last 10 years said that treaties, these agreements between indigenous peoples and the state, serve to reconcile the pre-existing sovereignty of the indigenous peoples with the assumed sovereignty of the Crown. Now, those are very big words, but very important to reconcile. Treaties serve to reconcile. So there's a process of reconciliation where there is coexistence and sharing. In the case of the people in Tibet, it is, of course, a very difficult question. Are the people in Tibet now being colonized? It's all of the factors behind colonization, I would suggest, are at play here. And we've seen that in other parts of the world. In my country, certainly, we've seen it, we've lived with it, and we have been part of that. So we have been making efforts, and we've made political efforts. We've demonstrated on the streets. We've blockaded offices, roads and railways. We've occupied government offices. But the biggest stride that we've been able to make in Canada has been through the courts. And the courts have been able, when we were finally able to go to the courts in Canada in the late 1950s, we took advantage of that and began the process, a long process of setting the relationship on a fair and equitable footing. And that's what we have been doing. On the second question, the various, of course, international instruments, the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, the Universal Periodic Review, various international treaties with existing treaty bodies to oversee the implementation. We've taken advantage of those venues and have made reports to the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, for example, in relation to Canada, in relation to the United States, and Indigenous people globally have taken steps. And of course, the treaty body is able only to make recommendations on how to the state to address these issues. So there's a record, an ongoing record in place as we've taken steps to put on a very public record and on international record as well these activities and these steps that we've taken. There is only one really important treaty. It's not a treaty or a convention, it's a declaration on the rights of Indigenous peoples. It's not a convention, but being that it's not if it was a convention, the only way it would apply to a particular state is if the state signed onto it. So there's a debate in the Indigenous world whether or not this declaration should become a convention, becoming part of the hard international law, as we call it, or whether it would continue to be a declaration that applies as soft international law to state governments. And what we've done is we've taken the articles in the declaration, and in cases that we've brought before the courts, we are now using the norms, the standards in the legal arguments that we present to the courts. And courts have now started picking this declaration up and using it. The state of Belize, for example, is a former British colony, and the Mayan people have used this declaration in their land right dispute with the state of Belize and have been very successful. That now there's a process of demarcation of lands that the courts have determined to be Mayan territories, and it's an ongoing process. The decision was within the last several months. At the United Nations, there are three mechanisms that deal with Indigenous issues. The one is the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, and that's set up under a resolution of the Economic and Social Council, one of the main arms of the UN. And there are two other mechanisms that are set up under the United Nations Human Rights Council based in Geneva. And that one of those is very relatively new. It's probably 6 or 7 years in operations, called the Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And that particular mechanism has a mandate to do in-depth studies on education, on access to justice, for example, are several of the studies that they've developed. Very important findings and conclusions that they have come to, and their report goes to the Human Rights Council, and the recommendations, of course, then with the adoption of the recommendations, the implication for states. At the Permanent Forum, similarly, the report, it's a 2-week meeting, generally at the end of April and early May, 2 solid weeks, and we have Indigenous peoples around the world. We have state representatives, we have non-governmental organizations, and we have the United Nations agencies attend these sessions. It's the second largest gathering at the United Nations in New York every year, the first largest gathering being the women's issues. And they meet, their gatherings are much, of course, bigger. Resources and funding for the Permanent Forum and the other bodies, the expert mechanism, are very limited. So it's not as effective as it could be. So the reports that are prepared by the Permanent Forum then find it's presented to the ECOSOC when they meet. and they will take that and endorse the report. If in the report there are particular, there's sometimes there's this idea of naming and shaming state governments. It's highly discouraged, but sometimes it happens. And when the report ends up at ECOSOC, there's a tendency for the state, maybe it's Bangladesh, for example, with Chittagong Hills tribes and the lands that are in question, that particular state would say, we want those paragraphs removed. And of course, then it becomes a matter of diplomacy to keep those recommendations in. The very last mechanism at the UN is a special rapporteur in the rights of indigenous peoples. The current special rapporteur is Victoria Tauli Corpus from the Philippines. The previous special rapporteur was Professor James Anaya from the University of Arizona. Now, where there are human rights allegations, specific and current, those allegations and complaints go to his office. But there are strict guidelines and limitations that he has. He needs to ensure that he advises the state, and he will await for an invitation from the state to examine the allegations and the allegations of violations that are being alleged. And he will prepare a report that is constructive in nature to find a resolution to the problem. And that's generally the function of that particular mechanism. That is established by the Human Rights Council, and the reports from that special rapporteur, part of the special procedures under the Human Rights Council, end up at the Human Rights Council as reports. These are then tabled with the UN General Assembly as well.
Now, questions from the floor? Anyone?
I have a question which is just related to Upper Australia, related to whether writing makes any difference to the Indigenous classification. Tibetans have a long history of writing. Most of the Indigenous people that you've mentioned so far did not. Does that make any difference?
I don't think it does, but it could. In the Americas, not specific forms of writing, for example, but different forms of communication that were very largely oral traditions handed down from generation to generation, but it's not a specific requirement. But it doesn't mean that it could not be a requirement. The song lines of the Indigenous peoples in Australia are as important as documents that are written on a paper, because these are stories on the land by the people, and it's as important, in my opinion, as a document that's written that reflects the history of those peoples. There's different ways to capture that same idea, but thank you for that question. I don't think it...
Yesterday, I think Solomon also said, if you want to preserve your civilization, culture, or custom, language is key. To preserve language, scriptures is key. Unless you have scriptures, alphabets, then I think language, if it's just oral, then the threat is such that it gets diluted, then eventually disappeared. Once the language disappears, then the custom and the culture and the civilization, then the identity. Hence, writing is very important.
And I think His Holiness is correct on that point.
Shiva? Shiva Shanda.
Yeah, I'm curious to know more about the reservations that you spoke about in US and in Canada for the indigenous people. So, is it in a kind of settlement type that you require to have a permit to go out of the reservation? Because otherwise all immigrants, for instance, the United States is free to move anywhere. So we don't see many, indigenous people around like in different parts of the U.S. So it's kind of prohibited to go from one place to
Thank you, and maybe I left the wrong impression, and thank you for asking that very important question. That was the law. That law has changed since. Where my wife's community, the territory of the people there who speak a particular language is covered by the city of Vancouver, the city of Richmond, the city of Delta. Their entire territory is covered by cities and municipalities. But the law says that underneath all of those continue to exist the land rights of the Indigenous peoples. In the small lands that have been set aside for them becomes the foundation for their communities, where they have lived for thousands of years. They still live there in those same places that their ancestors lived. But most of the land's taken up for other purposes, for development, for homes, for industry. And so within all of that, they struggle and continue to survive and thrive as peoples in the midst of all of everything that surrounds them. They have been very strong in keeping their traditions despite all of the challenges that they've run into. In the northern part of the province where I come from, my village is about 40 miles, 50 miles from the nearest non-Aboriginal settlement. And so we're the chiefs in our own domain. We hunt, we fish, we go anywhere we want in our territory. We don't have to ask permission from anyone because we know that's where we're from. We've been there for thousands of years, and we feel we don't have to ask permission from anyone to go anywhere. And similarly, in their case, they do travel around, and they continue to thrive in a different way compared to my people. But that community in the Lower Mainland has been tremendous leadership for all Indigenous peoples in Canada, because they're the ones that have taken these cases to the courts in the face of all the odds, have been able to be very successful on matters relating to fishing, for example, matters relating to land rights. And so piece by piece, one block, 1 acre at a time, they're retaining some of their lands back.
I met an Australian woman, and she said she belonged to the member of stolen generation, and whereby the infants and the children are taken away from the Indigenous families, and they are taken and they are integrated with the family of the non-Indigenous. Does that happen in your community?
Yes, not exactly in the same way. When the Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, apologized to the Australian Indigenous peoples for the stolen generations, I was invited by our national Indigenous organization to represent Indigenous peoples in Canada at the apology, which I accepted that invitation, and I attended that very historic apology by former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd. And it was such a tremendous impact to hear the Prime Minister apologize the way he did to the people. And the story behind it, as you said, children were taken, half-caste children taken and put into homes away from their communities against the wishes of their families. And, it created tremendous havoc amongst the peoples, in particular those who were taken and forced relocation from their communities. They had no choice, and their parents had no choice, and their communities had no choice. It was heartbreaking to hear that story. In Canada, I'll give you the story of my own family. I went to an Indian residential school for many years, and I asked my late father, why there's a school over there, public school, why don't you let us go there? He said, you're not allowed to go to that public school. You only can go to the Indian residential school. And then he told me later on that when he was a child, my grandparents, his parents, mom and dad, his mother and father, kept him home one year. And when the school season was to start in September, not very long afterwards, the police and the game warden, the game officials came to our village, and they went to my grandfather and my grandmother and said, "You have to give that boy to us. He's got to go to a residential school." And he said that if you don't give him to us, we will arrest you and put you in jail. So in a way, that the same story is there. I would really encourage you to take a look at the report that just was recently delivered by Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission. A very extensive report. It has 94 recommendations as to the way forward. But it's in 6 volumes. There's one volume that deals strictly and only with survivors and their stories. And if you're interested in knowing a bit more about that, I think you can look at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission website, TRC, or Truth and Reconciliation Canada, and it will explain the history. And while I'm there, I wanted to say that internationally, Truth Commissions and Truth and Reconciliation Commissions have been a very important tool that's been used in South Africa, for example, following the dismantling of the apartheid, or in the Latin American countries where indigenous peoples have disappeared, where there have been truth commissions, and there are probably at least a dozen truth and reconciliation or truth commissions by different names, but fact-finding commissions that have been established either through the auspices of the nation or under the auspices of the United Nations to examine particular violations, and they become an effective tool to determine the magnitude and the degree of human rights violations and abuses. And in Australia, of course, we had the Stolen Generations report that formed then the next step to the apology about the stolen generations. So I think it's a very good question. Thank you.
The apology was never accepted by the Aboriginal people.
Any other questions? No.
About the definition of the indigenous people became clear from your answer to Honorable Sigam. I was a little more tempted by the notion of the First Nation. So does the First Nation needs to be a nation now?
We used we struggle with the term Indian, if you can appreciate that, because we have our own names for ourselves as peoples from the different tribes, and we determined in the early 1980s that we are the first peoples, but we are also the peoples who formed the very first nations in the Americas. So in Canada, we adopted that term First Nations because we were the first peoples to own and occupy the territories that formed the territories of our people, the territorial integrity. Of course, we fought with each other, we had wars, and we collaborated, and we had peace. But yes, and that was the idea. Are we independent nations? No. In the sense that we were the First Nations, but we continue to have a degree of sovereignty within our own respective territories. The sovereignty is diminished greatly in many respects, and our relationship on matters of sovereignty are only with the state, the national government, not the local provincial governments. But you know, there are very diversity of opinions. There are some tribes who, in the United States and in Canada, who have said that we continue to maintain that we have sovereign status as peoples, notwithstanding that we are mired in poverty, that we are deeply colonized, we will continue to remain as sovereign peoples. And so we have a very big diversity of views within the indigenous population in Canada and the US, but in other parts of the world as well. And it's in Latin American countries, I hear the same stories. So the people decide what it is that their relationship should be with the state. You know, I might have my own opinion, but as a collective, we determine what our relationship ought to be. And we determine that through our own. There are some things that are absolutely inviolable to our peoples that we need to keep those. Our traditional practices that were outlawed by and criminalized by government, those are absolutely important to us. We will continue to keep those. And the state has no business in those matters. These are our responsibilities. These belong to us, they don't belong to the state, and we will carry on those traditions in accordance with our teachings, in accordance with our principles of who we are as peoples, and in respect of our ancestors, the many generations that handed those. We have responsibility to them and to the future generations to keep that as strong as possible so that future generations in their time can continue to be, in our case, Dene people, or in the case of my wife, as Salish-speaking peoples, Halkominum-speaking peoples.
Any questions? I think that was very interesting and educating for us, especially the bond, the feeling. I think that everyone in this room felt towards you and you towards us when you were describing about the Tibetan person who spent so many years in prison. You were a bit emotional. I could see Tenzin Khalsa also tearing up. That's one of the many stories we all have been through. So either one of our family members have been through. So despite that you see CTA and staff members, all that, there's this underlying pain, there's this underlying suffering. Despite you being a Grand Chief of the First Nation, coming all the way to Dharamsala, on the one hand you want to know how we survive and how we struggle. On the other hand, we wanted to feel the pain of the Tibetan people. So that takes some courage, not just curiosity, but courage and a sense of strong solidarity to make it to Dharamsala to be with us. So this gesture on your part to bring not only yourself but your wife Wendy all the way from Canada to Mongolia to Dharamsala in many ways means a lot to us. So your presence here, as reflected by your Solanus yesterday, the event was almost turned to an indigenous peoples rights event. He gave 90% of the speech about indigenous people. I think this connection that we have, national connection, this had to be built more strongly. And I hope your presence here, your coming here, will carry the message back to your people of our stories, our struggle, our suffering, so that in solidarity we can move forward and make our people, indigenous people as well as Tibetan people, a better world to live in. So we don't lose our languages every week, that we don't lose our culture, we don't lose our custom and civilization every month or every year. So it does not become a struggle of failure, rather it becomes a struggle of success. So with that wish and hope that both of us, we will continue to aspire and fight for rights, and one day we will get to see and experience the true freedom, and you will get to see or realize all the 94 recommendations made by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So with that note, I will once again thank the Grand Chief and Wendy for coming to Dharamsala and on behalf of the staff members as well. So please give Grand Chief and also it is exactly 5:59 because our office ends at 6. So if I hold a minute later than 6, Unlike US and Canada, you don't get overtime. So I might get over complaints, you know. And also, you might not know our staff members, the road is blocked today. They are renovating the block. So I think many of you might have to walk all the way to McLeodganj. By the way, when you walk, you're walking the road called Potala Road. So hopefully from today on, when you walk up and down on Potala Road, you will recommit yourself, rededicate yourself that one day through Potala Road, we will actually go to Potala Palace, the rightful place for His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And that will be the true celebration of His Holiness' birthday. Thank you.